thank you for showing up for HRT 312.0.4. This is the last of the courses section. Today we're going to be talking about tasting beer. We're at an altitude of about 1,200 feet. It was a clear day with a little bit of wind. It was nice and sunny. We were halfway through the moon phase, if that matters to anybody. There is some dust and there is some pollen that's out there. It is the 6th day of February 2020, and I'm very happy and proud to introduce a great guy who is a Master Cicerone, multi-talented, multifaceted individual who knows more about beer than I could ever even think about talking about. He's a very eloquent speaker, very well educated, and he's going to teach us how to taste beer with some very fine products. Let me introduce, and can I get a big round of applause for Gavin Harper?
All right, thank you guys. So, thanks Owen. Welcome, glad to be here. And hopefully we can enjoy, maybe not everything, but enjoy most of what we have here. So, just today's objective, enjoying beer. So not going to get too philosophical, but thinking like beer relativism. Essentially, if I like it, it is good. That's kind of the focus for today. Not really going to get into the subjective sort of qualities of what determines the goodness of a beer. Really want to get to where you guys create your own sort of experience and determine what you enjoy and how you can maybe get a little bit more out of evaluation, some evaluation techniques, some skills, some little things that may help you become a better beer taster, better beer evaluator. So that's really the focus for today. We will discuss a little bit on flavor vocabulary, descriptive vocabulary, why it may be a little bit difficult to describe some of the things that we are perceiving, or why someone else perceives something that maybe we don't. So dive a little bit deeper into that as well. That's really the focus for today. So first thing is just take a moment to think about what senses influence our perception of beer. So we have sight, hearing, touch, smell, taste. So of these senses, do all of them, do some of them, just what comes to mind in terms of what we use and how this affects our evaluation of beer. So just think about that for a minute, and let's talk about what flavor is. So flavor is really just a notion that's constructed by the evaluation of our senses. So which senses are those when we talk about flavor? And so in reality, all 5 senses are going to have some sort of influence on what we perceive as flavor. So sight, you can look at the beer and it's going to tell you, is it a certain color? That may influence an opinion made about what you think it's going to taste like. Whether it's right or wrong is irrelevant. It could be clear, it could have thick foam, no foam. There could be bubbles sitting to the, clinging to the edge of the glass, indicating a dirty glass. There could be a number of things that you can draw a conclusion on just by looking at it. Pretty straightforward. Hearing is one of the ones where it's a little bit more abstract, a little bit more psychological, but it can influence our perception. A lot of times what we hear, maybe it's music or something, can influence our mood. It could be something that you like or you dislike, and this could have an influence with our perception. We're not going to get too deep into that, but the other thing with hearing is it can be a distraction. So if we're going to talk a little bit in a minute about focus and trying to create habits that will free up your conscious brain, conscious mind to focus on the evaluation, to where if you have a lot of distractions in terms of noises, then your brain's trying to figure out, oh, should I focus on this? Should I focus on that? So these can influence how we perceive a certain beer. So the main things that we're going to deal with and talk about are going to be with aromas, taste, and touch, which is going to be your mouthfeel. So what's interesting about aromas is that's a majority of what we perceive, and it's linked to emotions and it's linked to memory. So I really strongly cannot emphasize enough how much really just smelling before we even put it in our mouth when we start evaluating these beers is really pick up on what you're smelling and try to identify as much as possible. Because if you can make a connection emotionally or from a memory, it's gonna stick there. and it's always gonna be there. Every single aroma that we perceive, it's in our brain forever. It's not in our working memory, it's not in our long-term memory that can fade over time. It's always gonna be there. Now, it's sometimes maybe hard to pull that out and describe it, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But aroma is really, really the key, okay? So we're gonna talk about some evaluation techniques and whatnot. But with taste is pretty straightforward. The main thing with taste is it triggers a hedonic decision. So basically, do I like it or do I not? It just almost immediately triggers that. Like, for instance, when we're really young, bitterness is something that fundamentally is telling us we shouldn't be eating this. It's something that we should spit out. There's something wrong with it. So it's somewhat of an acquired taste. But taste kind of triggers that, all different tastes. And when we talk about touch, it's the mouthfeel. So anything that's in the mouth that's textured, could be any type of trigeminal sensations, these sorts of things. But the main thing is that all 5 senses really play a certain role in how we evaluate and how we draw conclusions on what it is that we're perceiving. And then lastly, our past experiences and preferences. So this is really going to be kind of going back to memories, or if something smells like your grandma's cooking or your grandma's house, you may make some sort of connection with that. And that's just automatically going to trigger, I like this. And if there's something in there that you traditionally don't like, that may trigger something that you don't like. So your past experiences and preferences based on what you've been exposed to and what you like is going to also have an influence. Okay? So that's the main thing about flavor. So we're going to dig a little bit deeper into flavor and what I call the flavor triangle. So again, the more abstract sort of sight and hearing, we're going to leave that to the side for now and really focus on these 3 things here, which is going to be aroma, mouthfeel, and taste. So taste is anything, and we're trying to clear because sometimes taste is used a little bit loosely. But taste is really our 5 main tastes, and we could argue fat and metallic are, we could argue for and against those, and maybe the jury's still out whether we actually have sensors to taste these. But mainly bitter, salty, sweet, sour, and umami. These 5 basic tastes. So anything that's not those 5 tastes are going to be something that you would use a mouthfeel descriptor or mainly aromas. So we can't smell sweet. We can't smell salty. We can't smell acidity or sourness. But I hear that all the time. So we'll get a little bit more into kind of the vernacular and how we describe things. But taste is fundamentally just those 5 things. And I know fat is up here just because you can arguably say that we have receptors for that kind of oily, fatty quality. But that's all taste is. So everything else, if we say something tastes like a strawberry, what we really are perceiving is it smells like a strawberry. If it tastes sweet, then yes, it tastes sweet. So aromas, which there are thousands and thousands of different aromas, are pretty much everything else. And these are just some big picture broad descriptors such as floral, spicy, earthy, waxy, fruity, etc. These are all aroma descriptors and characteristics that we can find in all different types of beers. And so when we say something something tastes like a strawberry, we're actually getting all of the aromas that could be in a strawberry, but we're perceiving something. It could be 2 or 3 compounds, it could be maybe a dozen or so compounds that we perceive in a strawberry, and it happens to be in this particular beer. And so that's how you want to make a connection. What's interesting about that is we have somewhere about 1,000 receptors for to detect aromas. And there's a lot more chemical compounds, aroma-active compounds than that. But every individual has, let's just say, every individual has about 300 of these that are active. But no one has the same group. So there's some overlapping, but you may be able to perceive a certain half a dozen compounds out of strawberry, and this person may be able to receive another half a dozen, but maybe only 2 or 3 of the same. So something that is perceptible as a strawberry for you is not what you perceive as a strawberry. So that's one of the reasons why, oh, this smells like a strawberry. It's like, well, I don't get any strawberry characters out of this. So aromas can be very tricky in that sense that what someone perceives is not the same actual compound that someone else perceives, and they associate that with something else. It may be a cherry, or maybe some other fruit, or some flower, or something else. But the main thing is that majority of the flavor that we perceive in beer is going to come from aroma. We're going to talk about how to evaluate this and get a little bit more into some techniques to try to pull some of these things out. And then lastly, mouthfeel. So these are things like body, the viscosity, the creaminess or the thickness or thin qualities. Things like the cooling of mint or the kind of burning of alcohol or the spicy quality of capsicum heat from hot pepper or that sort of biting spicy quality of like ginger. So all of these are going to be mouthfeel, so pain receptors or just the overall viscosity and density of the beer in our mouth. So this is the flavor triangle. This is going to be the focus. And understanding that all of these things, it's a conglomerate. Flavor is all of these things. It's not just, the flavor of whatever's in the mouth. And generally flavor is kind of isolated to, it's what's in the mouth. When you smell something, that's an element of flavor. When you feel something, that's an element of flavor. That's something really important I think we should understand. And then with the tongue map, the old tongue map where we have locations on the tongue that actually say, okay, this is where we perceive bitter or sour or sweet or salty. When this came out 60 or so years ago, it was just put out there based on one person's sort of empirical experience that they just said that this is where it must be. There's no scientific sort of backing behind that. But what we do know now is that we have receptors or papilla everywhere throughout the tongue, in the mouth, the roof of the mouth, the cheeks, but especially the tongue. So everywhere we can perceive these bitter, salty, sweet, sour, umami, everywhere, all throughout the tongue. So the old tongue map, it's out the door. We don't use it. Unless there's maybe old textbooks. It's not in any textbooks anymore. At least hopefully it isn't. But you may have seen that at some point in certain school textbooks or whatnot. So let's get into talking about evaluation. So, and the first thing we're going to do is we're going to number one, which is the DBA. So that's when we talk about some of these techniques and we start trying to pull back some of the layers of this beer. That's what we're going to use first, so just so you're prepared. But the main thing is focus. So I talked about earlier how we want to free up our conscious brain so it's not being distracted. We're not actually worrying about this or worrying about that or worrying if we're going to get this text from this person or whatever. So you want to be really focused and dialed into the evaluation. And there are two different mindsets. So the first one is the most common. What probably most people do is they just smell the beer, taste the beer, whatever it is, and say, I perceive this, whether it's some bready quality or some floral quality or some, just whatever comes to mind. It's like, this is I'm getting a bunch of chocolate or I'm getting whatever. It's just whatever comes to mind, and then that's going to be how you come about making a descriptor, or if you're writing about it, or if you just want to talk about it or describe it. And that can be certainly very effective. The other mindset is going to be actually asking a question, a true or false question, is this present? And so you can start with big picture. You can start fruity. Is fruit present in the beer? Yes or no? If it's yes, okay, is it citrus? Is it pome fruit? Is it stone fruit? Is it berries? And then, yes, it's citrus. And then you go into, okay, so what type of citrus? Is it lemon, lime, orange, grapefruit? It's orange. What type of orange? Is it navel orange? Is it mandarin orange? It's like, do you even know what the difference of those are? Maybe, maybe not. You can just make it up. A lot of people do. But like, for instance, what separates a mandarin orange from other oranges is it has a compound called thymol, which is an herbal, you guys are probably familiar with thyme, has an herbal quality to it. So the mandarin orange has that. So if you perceive a little bit of a thyme character with orange, then this is like mandarin orange. So you can ask yourself questions, work yourself from big picture, such as fruit, such as citrus, such as what type of citrus, etc. It takes a lot longer because you're kind of going through, okay, we'll do fruit, we'll do floral, we'll do earthy, we'll do funky, we'll do sulfury, we'll do roasty, any sort of big picture descriptor. And then you work your way down. You can ask specific compounds, such as, is diacetyl present in this? Is dimethyl sulfide present in here? So it takes longer, but generally it yields truer results. And it's a different mindset. And to really be a good evaluator of a beer, that's the best way to go to really get a true sort of picture of what it is that you're perceiving. So take a moment now and number one, and just focus on the aroma for right now. Okay, we really want to focus on the aroma and get used to smelling it and trying to come up with anything. So whatever comes up, whatever comes to mind. So I want to hear what you guys are perceiving. There's no right or wrong answers. No one can tell you what you are experiencing is incorrect. You may be mistaken, but you're not wrong. What is it? Apple? Okay, yeah. So what else? Any other things come to mind? Yeah.
Caramel.
Caramel. And as this is just psychologically, as people say things, you're probably going to say, oh yeah, I get that. Even if it's not there. It's just the way our brains work. Maybe not, but anything else? Yeah.
It's not perfume.
What is it?
Perfume.
Perfume. So that's perfume. So here's a perfect time to say, okay, now let's dig a little bit deeper. So what type of perfume? Anything specific? Like a brand, I may not know of it, but it may be like,
It's
what
beige
quality?
perfume, but I can't really pinpoint on.
Okay. So and we'll talk about this a little bit later of why we can't pinpoint that. It's there's a reason why that is so difficult. So what else?
Like foamy.
Foamy.
Foamy, whatever that means.
All right. So again, so this is where it's interesting because I hear all the time, like so foamy. So you're smelling foamy.
Yeah, foam. Like if there's foam.
So that's interesting. So honestly, I don't know what that means. Like but it's interesting. So just to be aware of how we describe things. So I mentioned earlier we can't smell sweet, but I hear it all the time. Oh, this smells sweet. But you can't smell it. Like it physically isn't possible. Physiologically is not possible. But it's just how we the words and the language we use to describe things. So smelly, foamy. So the key here is when you really try to take a understand when we start to describe something, what does that mean? And just critically think about what it is that I'm trying to come across. And again, this is very difficult, and we'll talk about why. But we smell foamy. So what do you think that means? So you're associating something that's foamy with something that you're smelling. So that's what's happening.
It smells like when you're pouring Coca-Cola and it, like that foam.
Okay, so now you're starting to dig into what's actually happening.
Yeah.
Because when someone says they smell sweet, it's an association. So if it's like vanilla is a really common one. Vanilla itself is not sweet. But most things that we have that are vanilla flavored or vanilla in it are sweet, like a vanilla ice cream. So if we smell vanilla, people commonly say it smells sweet. But it's an association. So we're associating the vanilla or whatever it is with vanilla ice cream or something, vanilla wafers or something, I don't know. So, anything else? Any other flavor descriptors?
Valencia oranges.
Valencia oranges. All right.
I get the bubble, like how he said, like bubbles. I get bubble bath.
Bubble bath. So bubble bath is like, that's like wide open, right? I mean, I'm sure there are all types of scents in.
Orangey, like caramel bubble bath. Like, you know,
Caramel
the
bubble
Bath and
bath.
Body- To be exact, I don't know why I think of like an exact Bath and Body Works, the like vanilla warm bubble bath. So I don't know.
Yeah, so here's what's interesting. So foam, you heard foam. I was talking about vanilla. If we hadn't discussed those things, I can't guarantee it, but I'm thinking you probably wouldn't have gone there. So this is I don't want to get too deep into the psychological world, but it really influences our perception. So when people start talking about it, saying this, saying that, we just say, oh, well, it must be there. If somebody else says it, then it must be true. That's why, again, the goal here for today is to not really talk about what defines the goodness of a beer, but it's what you perceive, and give you some tools to try to evaluate the beer, use some true and tried techniques, but then also be true to yourself, and don't question yourself, and then when you do have some sort of observation, is think about what is it that you're saying, and what is that, does that make sense, is it really there, and whatnot. So bubble, anything else? Nothing else? All right, so we're gonna go through, we're gonna use the same sample, and we'll talk about specifically, yeah. Oh, no, so here are some evaluation techniques. So the first couple things I wanna just sort of recommend, you don't have to do this if you feel a little awkward. I'm left-handed, so typically if I eat with my left hand, I drink with my right hand. When I want to evaluate a beer, I use the opposite hand. So, suggestion, you may feel awkward, you may make a mess, that's fine. I don't know if it's fine, if you want to make a mess.
It's fine. It's fine.
But it's just a suggestion. Use the opposite hand than you normally drink with, because you want to create habits. And habits are part of our subconscious brain. So we don't have to use our conscious brain for effort and energy on things that we don't really need to. So we develop habits. So I use the opposite hand, and then I swirl. This says, you can see it, 45 RPMs. So it has to be exactly 45 RPMs. No, it's an arbitrary number. So you can just, it's basically just something in your brain, you want it to be consistent. So if it's 45 RPMs, if it's 145, if it's 3, whatever that is, even if what you're actually physically doing isn't consistent, if you're telling yourself some arbitrary number, you start to build that habit, and it's a subconscious, a true habit. So again, it's consistency. We're setting ourselves up, our brain up for this is evaluation. We want to focus. We use the opposite hand than we normally drink with. We're putting a swirl, and we're telling ourselves, okay, this has got to be 45 RPMs or whatever it is. And then the other thing is, when I evaluate, I use sort of my ring finger, maybe my pinky, to kind of rest the glass, and then I have these 3 fingers to hold it. I don't normally drink, maybe out of habit, because I've done this, maybe I do in certain situations, but generally, I'm gonna hold, just like you would think, normally hold the glass. But when I am evaluating a sample for whatever reason, if that's for judging, or if that's for coming up with some descriptor for a brewery I'm consulting for, or my own beer, trying to come up with some descriptor, or whatever it may be, I want to be really focused, and so this is sort of my habitual nature, what I do, and then I tell myself 45 RPMs. So suggestions that will help, but again, you have to sort of develop those habits. All right? So we're going to do a covered swirl. So you're going to take the opposite hand that you're not holding the beer with, and just put it on top. And then you're going to swirl the beer around, okay? And so it may take a little bit of some time to get used to it. But what we want to do is we want to release those aromas, and we're kind of trapping them in the headspace of the glass. So certain compounds may be a little bit more volatile, and so they're just going to fly away and never to be smelled again. So we want to keep those in. We want to trap them in, and we're also just concentrating the aromas in this area to where even if they're not super volatile, we're kind of just getting a concentration there. So this can be a very useful technique to get a little bit more intense. Maybe we're not smelling. Maybe you smell it at first and you're like, I don't really get much. So this can maybe help just add a little bit more intensity. So when we actually go to sniff the beer, we can think of a short sniff or a 1 second sniff. Again, somewhat arbitrary, it's just a short sniff. So swirl the beer, you can cover swirl, and you just do a quick sniff. It can be half a second. You just think short sniff, 1 second. So when you do that, again, 2 different mindsets. You're looking for something specific or whatever comes to mind. So just take a moment, do that covered swirl, do a short sniff, and again, you can think of something specific. We heard bubble bath, we heard foam, we heard mandarin orange, we heard apple, we heard caramel, we heard, what was it?
Perfume.
Perfume. So maybe these things are coming to mind now. Maybe not. So the intensity of the sniff can be really intense or just, maybe I couldn't hear that. So the intensity can be varied as well. So short, the intensity can be varied to very intense, aggressive, to soft. And the reason we want to do different sort of sniffs is certain compounds are more perceptible in certain ways, such as like the compound is a sulfur compound, hydrogen sulfide, H2S, like a rotten egg compound. It can, if you really inhale, it will saturate your olfactory system, and you won't be able to smell it for a couple minutes. So if you really inhale, and then all of a sudden, you try, oh, was that there? I don't know. And then you keep going back for a couple minutes. Well, no, it's not there, so you may think it's not there. And then after a couple minutes, if you go back to it, it may still be there. So that's one of the reasons you want to have different intensities, different lengths. So the other one's going to be a long sniff, or a 2-second sniff. So the same thing, you can do a covered swirl, and then you're just going to go in, and you can count 1, 1,000, 2, 1,000, or whatever, Mississippi, or whatever number, whatever word you want to use, or just count to 2, whatever. But just a longer sniff. And again, the intensity can be really intense, or just a nice, gentle, or somewhere in between. You may perceive different things. So try that for a moment. And then as you do that, are there any other things coming to mind that you're perceiving now? Yeah?
Like a light copper.
Light copper, okay? So like penny, like a penny?
Yeah, like a pen.
Okay. Anything else? Yeah.
Maybe a little bit of like dark chocolate
Dark chocolate, all right.
and like a lightly toasted piece of bread.
Lightly toasted piece of bread, good, yeah. So do you notice a difference between when you do a short sniff versus a long sniff, or change the intensities, when you cover it, when you don't cover it? So all of these are going to be valuable, and they're going to tell you something different about the beer. Maybe that's very similar, but you are going to have a slightly different perception depending on what technique you use. So the other one, and for some reason, maybe it's just the name, people tend to like this one. I'll be people that I've taught classes, before, and they're like, oh yeah, they're drive-by guy. So drive-by, where is it? Here we go, drive-by sniff. For whatever reason, people like the drive-by sniff. So,
Did it not turn off?
it's not turning off. So the drive-by sniff. So this is there's 2 little techniques. One can be, and you can swirl it, or you don't have to swirl it, but essentially what you're doing is you're driving past your nose. And as you do it, again, short sniff, long sniff. Choose one or the other, intensity. And then what comes to mind. So why this is so effective is essentially you have a neutral, again, neutral is maybe you're wearing perfume, maybe you're wearing something, but you've been wearing it all day. Your shirt smells like this, your shirt smells like that. You've been wearing it all so for you, it's neutral. You're in this room, whatever aromas are here, it's neutral. So when I say neutral, that's what I mean. It's your base, your sort of calibration point for right now. So when you drive by, you get a little bit of a change. So a lot of times, just that drastic change from neutral to something, it's a lot easier, or sometimes it may be more intense, but you're able to perceive a little bit different. So it can be very effective. And so the other thing, the variation is just holding it out. It can be anywhere, is you just come in and then back out. So it's the same effect. Now, you may be, I don't know, some people may be self-conscious about doing this, like in a public area, I don't know. But it's worth trying out. People may be asking what you're doing, and it's an opportunity to engage in conversation and have everyone do it. That might be kind of cool. So take a moment and go through these again and see if we come up with any other descriptors. So Anything else coming to mind? We exhausted it?
It's more like like that Sprite smell, but with orange.
Okay. It's like orange Sprite. I don't even know if they make orange Sprite, but the orange soda, something.
Yeah.
All right. So now, the next thing is we can actually taste it and swallow it. Finally, right? So take a moment, taste it. Don't swallow it immediately. You can actually kind of let it rest on the tongue a little bit and try to focus on taste. So when we talk about taste, sour, sweet, salty, bitter, umami, and really kind of focus on that. And then when you swallow, after you swallow, just exhale through the nose. So that's a good way, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So, any thoughts on the taste? So just those 5 tastes. Is it sour?
Bitter.
Bitter. So bitter. Is it sweet?
No.
Started sweet, then went bitter.
Yeah. It went
Okay,
bitter.
good. Yeah. So interesting. So we'll talk about that. So, is it umami? Does everybody know what umami is?
Salt.
Flavor.
So umami essentially is yumminess, or deliciousness. But what's that? It's not that. Tell me what it is.
Well, no, I meant
Oh, got it. Okay, sorry. Oh, you mean the beer? Got it.
Yeah.
So umami. Very few beers have umami, but it's essentially MSG is umami. It's glutamate. So mushrooms, green tea, oolong tea. These things are rich in umami. Fish. But anyway, so we got mostly bitter. Started sweet, maybe a little bit bitter. Not any sourness, not any saltiness.
I thought it tasted a little nutty.
A little nutty.
A little bit.
All right, good. Yeah. All right. So would that be a taste or aroma?
Aroma.
Yeah. All right. So when I had you swallow, then I asked you to exhale through your nose. So what we're doing there is, and this is a lot of times how we describe flavor is when it's in our mouth. Oh, this tastes like a strawberry, or this tastes nutty. And the reason that is because a lot of times when something's in our mouth, we're still smelling. We're not smelling through our nostrils, we're smelling through the nares and the retronasal and the olfactory system, kind of in the back part of our mouths and throughout just the whole olfactory system. So what happens when we put it in our mouth and we swallow? It's carbonated. It warms up in our mouth. It moves around, so that the CO2 kind of releases aroma compounds. We swallow and then we breathe out of our nose. We perceive all those aromas, and it may be different than when we just smell it with our nostrils, just like this. So again, you may get a different perception. All of a sudden, nutty now comes through, where maybe it wasn't nutty when you smelled it. And so that's the retronasal. And you can intensify it by actually pinching your nose. You may get a little bit of pressure build up, but you can try pinching your nose, swallow, and then kind of an aggressive exhale through the nose. And again, you really intensify that retronasal, all those aromas that's happening after you swallow. So it's a really good way to perceive on the aromas in the beer that you can't always pick up just from smelling the glass. So try that if you want, but it's a really effective way, really effective tool. And then really you just want to repeat. So that's a good sort of overview of some techniques you can use to get a really good evaluation of what's going on. All right, so any questions about that, how we actually evaluate these techniques? All right? So let's talk about this beer a little bit more. Let's get into this beer. So Firestone Walker DBA, if you want to classify this beer, maybe this would be considered kind of like a strong bitter, an English strong bitter, which you could say is ESB. ESB is really just a brand from a brewery in England, but a lot of Americans just use that term as a catch-all for a strong bitter. So in England, anything stronger than 5% or anything above, say, 5% ABV is considered a strong beer. Where here, maybe anything maybe above 8% would be considered a strong beer. But that would be kind of what this is. It's an English pale ale, like a strong pale ale or a strong bitter. So a few little things here. So we have visual, deep clear copper. So the beer is clear. We have copper color. And again, we can start seeing, you know, we've heard copper. That was something that we used to, again, it may be that just looking at the color gives you the impression of something copper. And so now you might be, for some reason, maybe it triggers something, now it tastes like copper. So this is where the psychological aspects really play a large role into our perception. So the aroma, we got malt and toasted oak. So vanilla. So when we talk about oak, the oak that they use for this beer is kind of new oak that has been lightly or maybe medium lightly toasted. So you're gonna go get a lot of lactones, which are gonna be kind of almond and nutty, coconutty characters, and some of the lignin, which are gonna be the phenolic aldehydes, which give vanilla qualities. So I heard nutty, heard vanillin or vanilla. So most likely that's coming from the oak that this beer is partially fermented in. Texture, so medium body, mouth-filling effervescence. Generally your mouthfeel is the most overlooked aspect when we taste. We're so focused on aroma. And I even told you, focus on aroma. But it's really easy to overlook mouthfeel. So always be conscious of that, and then you go back. So you're focusing on aroma, what it tastes like. Oh, let me do this again over and over and over. And then lastly, like, oh, well, I forgot about mouthfeel. So then you go through and evaluate mouthfeel. So any thoughts about mouthfeel? Is this pretty, you know, this is one of the difficult things, medium body, because medium, it's a term that really, it's relative. I mean, everything's relative. This is what's medium, what's full, what's light. It's really relative to, again, our own personal experiences. If all we drink is a very pale, light beer, such as like Heineken, then this may feel more full bodied. If all we drink is, say, Guinness, which actually is ironically pretty light body, but most people think it's full body, this still maybe feel full body. But if all we drink is a big imperial stout, then this maybe feel very light body. So, so sometimes when we describe the fullness of a beer, it can be a little bit tricky because where's our calibration point? Where is, you know, how are we comparing this, or what are we comparing this to? So the taste. So English toffee and caramel. So we talk about taste. Again, we generally say it tastes like this, it tastes like that. So English toffee and caramel generally comes through maybe in the aroma, maybe it comes through when we put it in our mouth and we're getting through the retronasal. But that's kind of a lot of flavors, and that's what I heard. We're getting toffee and caramel characters. And what was interesting is most everyone said bitter kind of started off sweet. So we associate toffee, caramel, vanilla, these things with being sweet. And then sweet, salty, and sourness really hits our tongue up front first. So if it's sweet, we're gonna notice it right up front. If it's salty, we're gonna notice it immediately. Bitterness is a little bit more delayed. So if it's bitter, it may take a moment or two before we actually start to perceive it. So we may be associating toffee and caramel with sweetness, and then kind of goes away, and then the bitterness comes through. If we start dissecting this beer a little bit more, and I didn't hear this, well, maybe with a few things, but is there anything floral in this beer? Are you perceiving anything floral at all? No? Or anything herbal? Nothing? No one? So, the reason I really like to use this beer for a sort of evaluation is because we can really start to peel back. So, I heard some of the vanilla. If you can pick out some of the nutty qualities of some of the vanilla character, and then peel back even a little bit deeper, is there's a noticeable kind of lilac flower character. You may not know what lilac is, or you may not be able to say, oh, I don't know what that smells like. Maybe it's a lavender, but just think of flowers. You know, we did hear perfume, so generally I think perfume is more floral perfume. And so that's something I get when I really dig deep into this beer, is a noticeable sort of lilac flower. And then the other thing is I get like a thyme, and it may be the mandarin orange thing. You know, we heard the oranges and kind of that has that little bit of that thymol compound in there. There's a little bit of that herbal sort of herbal thyme character in the beer too. And it's there, and it's something that you have to really kind of dig past the caramel and the toffee and maybe some of the other malty qualities like the nuttiness and the oak characters. But it's something that's there, so you can really kind of pull back the layers and then ask yourself that. Sometimes it will reveal itself. So has anybody been successful to pick up? So just start saying flowers or lavender or something that sticks to you. Like, yeah,
Chrysanthemum.
chrysanthemum, yeah. So like something that triggers that you know what this is. Maybe not hibiscus. Hibiscus is a little bit more fruity, kind of cranberry-like. Or herbal. Think rosemary or thyme or some sort of herbal quality. But that's what I feel when I really dig deep. Those are two things that really stick out for me. All right. So no one else was able to pull it out. So try the retronasal. So actually take a sip, inhale before you swallow. You can hold your nose and then breathe out of your nose after you swallow. And then think flowers, lilac flowers, chrysanthemum, lavender. Think thyme, rosemary. Maybe it pops up. If it does, awesome. If not, well, try. Still nothing yet?
Oregano?
Oregano, there, yeah, that's, again, it's all association, it's all kind of trying to pull things together. All right, so now we're gonna go through a few other samples here, and what's gonna be a little bit different is instead of just taking a beer and thinking about descriptive terms, like we were talking about and throughout here, we're gonna talk about specific compounds. So all of these things that we've experienced, whether it's vanilla or nutty or perfume or floral or Valencia oranges or whatever it is, caramel, it's all a collection of actual compounds. So the compounds, again, there are thousands and thousands of them. In our language, we can't describe all these different compounds. So it's just a conglomerate of these compounds, and we say it's caramel, or we say it's strawberry, or we say it's nutty, or we say it's bubble bath, or perfume, whatever it is. So when we start learning and isolating specific compounds, what can happen is you're trained in these compounds, and then you can use the descriptors or you can use the compounds. So a lot of times, if you're training in 50, 100, 200 of these compounds, which a lot of either sensory scientists or sensory evaluators of beer or wine or other food or perfumes or whatever it may be, they're trained in these specific compounds, and then they think in those compounds. So the first one we're going to talk about, so number 2, so take that sample, go through our evaluation techniques. I'll put these back up here. And just see what it smells like, what it tastes like. So number 2. Like cake. Icing, all right?
Yeah, it's wedding cake.
Wedding cake. Wait, vinegar?
Yeah, it's like cake with hint of like vinegar.
Cake with a hint of vinegar, all right. Anything else?
Have you ever had nothing but cake?
Yeah.
What is it? Nothing
But cake?
but, I have not.
Okay, well, first off, you should try it.
Okay.
It reminds me of the
Frosting.
lemon butt cake for some reason.
Okay, all right. Yeah.
Biscuit batter.
Biscuit batter. All right? Yeah.
To me, it's with the butter that they put on your popcorn at the movie theater.
Oh. Okay. Is anyone else?
His stuff, bro. Jack.
Anything? What everyone said, or what anyone said? Does anyone get the same thing? Yeah.
Buttery, yeah.
Buttery? Is everyone getting butter?
Smells great.
Is butter starting to click?
Margarine.
Actually, you're probably more accurate there with margarine, I'll be honest with you. But that's actually so this is diacetyl, which is a compound that is The most common descriptor for it is butter or butterscotch. And it actually used to be what was used for movie theater popcorn. So yeah, that is accurate. But it doesn't mean that it's not in the icing that you may get from a certain cake, or the nothing but cake, or what any other things that would be used in food preparation. It's a common flavor used as a alternative for butter, and certainly margarine, which is an alternative for butter. That's vegetable oil, I think. But there probably is some diacetyl flavor in there just to give it a buttery character. But so this is diacetyl. So when we talk about specific compounds, I recommend saying the compound, smelling it, diacetyl, diacetyl, diacetyl. Because what happens is you isolate the compound, you learn the compound. You're never, it's not, if you're writing a descriptor for a restaurant or a bar or a brewery or something, you probably don't want to use technical terms. Oh, this is very loaded with diacetyl. Well, one, you don't really, generally don't want to advertise that because it's not usually a desirable flavor. Does anyone like this or dislike this? How many people like it? Okay, how many people dislike it? Oh, everyone else dislikes it. I'm assuming we're just prefer not to say. So this is most cases an undesirable flavor in beer. Whether you like the flavor or not, I think is doesn't really matter. For most brewers do not want this in their beer because it generally shows something went wrong. Maybe there was, you overlooked something, you made a mistake, something in the brewing process. Generally, it's a fermentation characteristic. The precursor is a byproduct of fermentation, and then it will show up. But the yeast will clean it up. So if you allow the yeast, you have good practices, the yeast will clean it up to below flavor threshold levels. However, there are some beers out there like Pilsner or Kel, or some English like a Boddington's or something. These beers are have a characteristic of diacetyl. It's part of their flavor profile. So for those beers, or for those brewers, it's not considered an off flavor. For most beers, it is. All right? So when you go through and you, yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say it kind of tastes like a flat beer.
Flat beer?
Is that wrong? Okay.
So yeah, I mean, basically, we've had these beers poured out, so maybe some of the carbonation has come out. But it's interesting that a lot of people think about flat beer, and English beer is commonly associated with diacetyl, and English beer is commonly associated with being flat. So there may be some sort of subconscious, something that maybe you were in England, maybe you had some beer in England, I don't know, there may be something where you're making that connection, or just from what people have heard. That's always possible. All right? So think of the compound when you're trying to make a connection with this. So you can think it's butter, it's butterscotch, it's icing, it's the nothing but cake, whatever it is. But try to make a connection with this, and it's best to think of, name the compound, diacetyl, as you smell it, as you taste it. The other thing too with this is it can have a little bit of a slick mouthfeel. So you may notice that on the palate, on the tongue, it's a little bit slippery, it's a little bit slick. Again, kind of going along with that buttery creaminess. All right? So let's go to the third one, number 3. So number 3. So let's go through our evaluation. And see what we get here, what we come up with. Didn't like it?
Well, I used to them all the classes so far.
2 and 10s. It is pretty intense.
I need them stronger this time.
Like apple juice. So we get apple juice. What? Kids apple apple juice, okay?
Canned corn.
Canned corn, all right? Anything else? Chlorine, all right?
Like molasses?
Molasses, okay? Anything else? So again, yeah,
Oh, I was gonna say like Angry Orchard and corn.
Angry Orchard and corn, all right. So, again, I really want to stress, no one can tell you what you experience is incorrect. What you experience is what you experience. Hopefully we've had a few examples here where try to illustrate our association. We associate this with this, that with that, this with that. And so it has an influence, and hopefully you can see how a lot of things influence what we perceive and how we draw a conclusion or come to a certain opinion about something. So this is dimethyl sulfide, or DMS. It's a sulfur compound, and it generally, the most common descriptor is canned corn, corn on the cob. Sometimes smells of cooked vegetables. So for me, I get kind of a strong V8 kind of vegetable juice with DMS. And definitely corn. I mean, this is definitely a canned corn, creamed corn sort of characteristic. So does that make sense? Is corn starting to click, or is vegetable juice, or anything, does that click? So hopefully when you evaluate the beer that was coming through, when you actually see what the actual descriptor is, hopefully that begins to click for you. So is this desirable? Do you guys like this or no?
Better than the
No.
butter one.
This is better than the butter one.
Still not desirable.
Still not desirable.
No.
But you think it's better as well?
No.
I mean, that's debatable.
Okay.
Retarded.
And again, we all have our own preferences. Some people like this, some people like that. So this is, again, another compound that it's a common off flavor, if you will. It generally is not desirable. It generally is not wanted in beer. The precursor for this compound comes from grain, the malt that's used in beer. But generally it's going to be boiled off. So part of the brewing process, it gets boiled, and most of it is gone. But you're typically going to find it with pale colored beers, because that precursor is generally driven off when the grain is being malted. So with the exception of some lighter kiln malts. So that precursor with pale beers, such as like pale lagers, such as like a Heineken, or pale Belgian beers, like Saisons, or if you guys are familiar like Duvel, or like Chimay, the white one. If you've seen these beers, familiar with them, like these beers have small amounts of noticeable DMS. Those are great beers, so not really off-putting. Not so much anymore, but it used to be like, you guys are familiar with like Shinerbach, or any of like the, historically the dark lagers, like the American lagers that have, that appear to be dark and not pale. These were traditionally made, and still to a certain degree, they don't really exist anymore, they're not very sellable or marketable. But they just use food coloring. So they use their pale beer, and they use some sort of food coloring to darken it up. So it was a pale beer, so it still had some of that DMS quality to it. There is also a well-known beer that has noticeable DMS in it, and it's PBR. So they clearly want some element of these sulfur compounds in their beer. It's part of their flavor profile. So we'll see a trend with all these. They're generally not desirable, but some brewers, well-known, successful brewers, do select for these flavor compounds for one reason or another. I think it has to do with trying to separate themselves from other similar beers, and then they maybe have a loyal customer for life. Like, well, I can't drink this because it doesn't taste like what I normally drink. So that was kind of why they maybe do this. All right, so the next one. So let's go to number 4. So let's take a moment. Let's go through that one.
This one smells good. This one smells good right off the bat.
What?
Well, I was like, oh, this one smells like straight apple juice, and then I was like, oh wait, straight apple.
This might just be apple juice.
Is there a correlation with bodiness and color, or does it just vary?
Yes. So, for the most part, if we're talking traditional brewing practices, or traditional, that could be subjective. But yes, there can be typically, the darker the color is, the malt that's being used has generally has higher amounts of unfermentable carbohydrates, which are going to yield body. So if that's not an absolute, there's always outliers to everything, so never deal with absolutes. But generally you can think, and this goes back to our site, we can come up with opinions or conclusions by looking at the beer. We see darker beer, darker color. Generally speaking, we can associate that beer as being fuller body, relatively. So maybe more medium full to full, but relatively fuller than something that's pale. But again, it could, maybe they're using food coloring, or maybe they use, you can use a really darkly roasted malt that has either wheat, which has no husk, or a deep husked malt, and that can actually use a very little bit in your recipe, and that can yield color, but it's not going to bring the flavor, it's not going to bring the body. So there are some outliers, so it's not an absolute, but generally speaking, the darker the beer, probably going to have a little bit more fuller body character to it.
The unfermentable sugars, is that what makes it more sweeter? Is that?
It could. Typically, the sugars that are unfermentable, so if we talk about like the sweetness quality of the scale as like 100. So sucrose, which is table sugar, has a scale of 100, let's say that. So what's sweet, like fructose, is like a 120. So it's a little bit sweeter than table sugar. And then like glucose is like an 80. And then we get to a trisaccharide is going to be like a 40. So these are all fermentable sugars. So you have a good, clean, and efficient brewing process and no issues. Those sweeter sugars are going to be gone. The ones that lead more to body, like the dextrins, they're like close to a 0 in terms of the sweetness level. So they're generally not sweet. The sweetness is going to come from perception or fermentable sugars that weren't fermented, or what we call back sweetened, when they add some sort of sugar or flavoring to the beer after fermentation. So generally, the larger chain sugars are a lot less sweet. One that maybe is lactose. So lactose can be used in some beers, can have a little bit of sweetness, and that's an unfermentable sugar. All right, so with number 4, any other descriptors?
Jolly Rancher.
Jolly Rancher.
The apple Jolly Rancher.
Yeah? Jolly Rancher. So yeah, everyone's pretty much on the same page with this one. This is actually pretty strong. Yeah.
It tastes like watered down apple juice.
Watered down apple juice. Yeah. Any type of apple. There are like, I don't know, like thousands
Green
of
apple.
varieties of apple.
Green.
Green apple, apple cider. Green apple. All right. So yeah, we're all pretty much on the same page, and that's good. This is pretty strong. I will say, people struggle with this actual compound a lot. So when we go back to the first one, or well, the number 2, diacetyl. What is it, like 56% of statistics are made up? So 25% of the people, no one got that?
I got it.
25% of the people cannot actually not perceive diacetyl somewhere in that number. Maybe it's 12, maybe it's 82, I don't know. But acetaldehyde, unlike diacetyl where people are essentially blind to it, acetaldehyde you can build up your tolerance. This is pretty strong. I feel like most people are on the same page with this. Green apple flavor, green Jolly Rancher, that's a descriptor I use a lot, like green Jolly Rancher, and really try to pick it out. But this isn't every single beer you've ever had. If it's not in the beer, then it's not a beer. It's in every single beer. It just generally is below the flavor threshold. And there is also a very well-known beer, the king of beers, Budweiser, is quite strong in acetaldehyde. It's also common in like a beer to guard style, which is a kind of a unique outlier, not very common. But it is a Rolling Rock as well. That's another one. I don't know how much is Rolling Rock still around? I don't know.
Yep.
Yeah.
Is this an Angry Orchard?
Angry Orchard, what? Yeah.
Is this one an Angry Orchard?
Is this Angry Orchard?
No. Is it in it?
Is it?
Is it in it?
I mean, I'm. There has to be some amounts just from it's a byproduct of fermentation. So acetaldehyde is actually part of the pathway to create ethanol. So when it goes through fermentation, the process called glycolysis creates acetaldehyde, and then acetaldehyde is then actually reduced to ethanol. So some remains in the beer. It excretes the cell wall and it remains actually in the beer. So I'm sure it's in Angry Orchard. But then it's also apples, so it's like a cider. So there's going to be just other apple flavors there as well. So again, if we think of a fruit or anything, it's a conglomerate of different chemical compounds. So we're isolating one simple, so when we smell a green apple, there's a lot going on there. One of those compounds, acetaldehyde. So when we detect a beer with acetaldehyde, then it generally is an undesirable, unwanted off flavor, if you will. But again, there are examples where it may be more prevalent. So, any questions with that? Everyone pretty much, yeah.
So diacetyl is also a product of not allowing the beer to ferment all the way?
Yeah, so essentially, acetaldehyde and diacetyl are both part of a larger group called carbonyl compounds. And so these are post-fermentation. If you have healthy, viable yeast, the yeast will essentially clean that up. Without getting too technical, that's what's going on. So the yeast will actually clean up those compounds. You have to allow the yeast to do that post-fermentation. And then they will at least reduce them to